All right. Well, this is part two of week two's lecture. If you have ever used the language, or if you've heard the language used, I go to church, then you already understand the impact of the establishment model of Christianity on the imagination and the belief structure of most Western Christians. This concept that we go to church as though church is some sort of place that we can arrive at is a failure to understand the nature of God's calling as it pertains to the Missio Dei. The church, and we know this, is ecclesia. It's the called out ones. The church is in no way, shape, or form a place that we arrive. It's a people to whom we belong. And for those who are a part of it, it's a verb. To be church is to be engaged in the Missio Dei. See, last week we began that conversation about establishment. And we talked about how the church in the establishment model of Constantinian Christendom sort of sat in the center. And in the lectures in the module for this lecture, you're going to see a number of different drawings, and I'm going to sort of walk through those drawings. But one of those drawings has the church in the center, and it sort of has a sphere around it with arrows. This is what I call the church in establishment, or the church in the Christendom model, is what I call impacted by centripetal force. Now, the word centripetal means it's the force that is exercised on an object as it orbits around something else, and it's pulling in. So, for instance, think in terms of gravity. So the Earth's gravity, as the moon spins around the Earth, there's a centripetal force that sort of is a pull in. It's a gravitas, right? And so within establishment Christianity, the church stands. The church not only as a people, but as a building, as a visible physical space. It stands in the center, and sort of everything gets pulled into it as the center of locus, or as the locus of importance, of civic interest. And so people can ask the question, what church do you go to? Back in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, the church was a place in which town hall meetings, everything sort of spun around or happened at the church. And that's a model that shapes our imagination. And so when we talk about the church, or we immediately associate it with a location. And what's unfortunate is I think that binds our imagination. It sort of values location and size and impact and centrality. Now, many of you are operating in an urban context, and and we talked about this last week, this idea of disestablishment. You know what happens when the church is the center of society is disestablished, and there's not that sense of that draw where everything can sort of go to. And so centripetal models of Christianity, I think, still impact many of the ways in which our parishioners imagine the life of the church. We're the church. People come to us. They arrive at us. We open our doors, and people are supposed to come. Why aren't people going to church anymore? These are the questions that often impact and influence the minds of many of those that are in our congregations readily. And so I think we need to be aware that Christendom has left us with a centripetal model of Christianity, in which the church as space, as place, sits at the center, and everything is sort of drawn or sort of there's a gravity that sort of brings everything in. It's about how often you're in the facility. It's about how many times a week you go to church. I didn't grow up in church, but I hear from a lot of times people will say things like, well, I was at church every time the doors opened. And our faithfulness was measured by how often we were in the facility. All the programs that we start serve out of that facility, and it sort of becomes this entity, this enclosed, sort of exclusive entity in of itself. This is the centripetal model is why so many churches are inwardly turned, because they believe sort of they're the end all be all, right? So like they're the church becomes an end in of itself, not God's means to a greater end, which is where we're going to be talking about what we're going to be believing, that God speaks to us through the Missio Dei, that the church in of itself becomes an end in of itself. and and that's why there's such grief when people don't come to church anymore. That's why when in a centripetal model, when the church is disestablished, there's this sort of lament that happens when the halls are no longer filled and teeming with people, when you've got these massive complexes that a few people gather in, that are trying to cover the overhead of these massive facilities, because though the culture has shifted, they still somehow believe that people are just supposed to show up and come and be a part of them. So that's the first part of what I would like to say about the missional church, is it recognizes that under the Christendom, this sort of Constantinian model, that that there's this centripetal force that then happens. And so that's number one, and we're going to come to the second diagram just in a moment. But I wanted to start out by just helping you understand the power of that centripetal force on the imagination of our people.